The paper was frozen inside the well bucket. Clara Voss saw it when she pulled the rope over the pulley and the bucket knocked against the stone lip with a hollow sound. At first, she thought it was a leaf trapped under the thin skin of ice. Then the morning light caught the dark lines of ink beneath the frozen water. No leaf had writing on it. She set the bucket down in the mud and stared. The yard was silent except for the wind pushing through the dry corn stalks behind the barn. Frost silvered the fence rails. The old mule stood under the lean-to with his head low, breathing steam into the cold. Inside the house, her father coughed. That sound made Clara move. She carried the bucket into the kitchen, set it beside the stove, and waited while the ice loosened around the paper. Her fingers were stiff from cold. But she did not put them near the fire. She kept watching the paper instead. Because something about it felt wrong before she could read a single word. When the ice cracked, she pulled the paper free and laid it flat on the table. The top bore the stamped mark of Vale Freight and Loan. Her stomach tightened. Below the stamp, the handwriting was neat and black. Clara Voss, Winter, Domestic Collateral. Cheyenne House transfer pending, father's signature. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to tilt. Clara read it again. Then a third time. Her father had signed nothing. The debt was not due for 10 more days. Lucian Vale had no legal right to write her name beside anything, much less those words. Domestic collateral. It was a clean phrase for an ugly thing. Her father coughed again from the bedroom. Weaker this time. Clara folded the receipt once, then unfolded it. Her first instinct was to throw it into the stove and watch the ink curl black. But bad paper could still become good evidence if a person had the sense to keep it. She tucked the receipt into the lining of her bodice just as hoofbeats came from the south road. Not one writer. 3. Clara stepped onto the porch. Lucian Vale rode in front on a pale gelding that looked better fed than any person in Frost Fork. His coat was dark, his collar clean, his gloves buttoned neat at the wrist. The two men behind him wore plain dusters and blank faces. They did not look at the house. They looked at the doors, the windows, the barn, the road out. Men checking exits. Lucian stopped near the porch and smiled as if this were a social call. Miss Voss. Mr. Vale. Is your father inside? He is unwell. That is unfortunate. Clara hated how softly he said it. Her father came to the doorway anyway. One hand braced against the frame. Elias Voss had been strong once. Clara remembered his arms lifting sacks of seed as if they weighed nothing. His laugh carrying across the lower field. Now his shirt hung loose from his shoulders, and the cold seemed to pass through him without asking permission. Lucian, Elias said. You're early. Winter is early too. Lucian swung down from the saddle. A man who waits for the date on paper often loses what little can still be recovered. The payment is due in 10 days. Yes. And you do not have it. Clara stepped off the porch and stood beside her father. Lucian glanced at her. Not like a man looked at a woman. Like a banker looked at a line in a ledger. There are humane arrangements, he said. Ways to settle hardship without seizing the whole farm. Clara felt the receipt against her ribs. You already wrote one, she said. Lucian's smile did not move, but his eyes sharpened. I beg your pardon. She pulled the receipt from her lining and held it up. The wind snapped the damp paper between them. You put my name on this before my father signed anything. Before the debt came due. Before you even asked. Elias turned toward her. Clara. Lucian's gaze stayed on the paper. For the first time? He looked annoyed. Not ashamed. Annoyed that she had found it too soon. That document is preliminary, he said. It was in our well bucket. One of my clerks must have misplaced it. One of your clerks crawled into our well. The two riders behind him shifted. Lucian's voice cooled. Miss Voss. You are young. You do not understand the mechanisms by which debt is resolved. I understand when my name is written without my consent. Silence fell across the frozen yard. Then another sound came from the north. A horse moving through the pine line. Slow. Steady. Clara turned. A rider came out of the trees on a broad dun horse, leading a pack mule heavy with canvas bundles. His coat was patched fur and dark wool. A hat shadowed his face, but not enough to hide the scar running down one cheek. Pale against weather-brown skin. He stopped 20 feet from Lucian Vale and looked at the receipt in Clara's hand. Then he looked at Lucian. His voice was low. Rough from disuse. Who weighs debt in this town? No one answered the scarred rider at first. The question hung over the frozen yard with the same weight as the receipt in Clara's hand. Lucian Vale looked him over. From the weather-stained hat to the pack mule. Then to the scar on his face. His mouth tightened. This is a private matter. The rider did not move. Debt usually is. Theft prefers it that way too. One of Lucian's men shifted in the saddle. Clara saw the rider notice without turning his head. He noticed everything. The men. The windows. The distance to the barn. Her father's shaking hand against the doorframe. My name is Ronan Pike. He said. I asked who weighs debt in Frost Fork. Elias Voss swallowed hard. The trading room. Mr. Abel keeps the assay scale. Lucian gave a short laugh. Gold dust and trapper arithmetic will not settle a legal claim. Then we'll let the scale and the clerk talk. Ronan looked at Elias. Sir. If you'll allow it. Elias stared at him as if trying to place a face from another life and failing. Then he nodded. The walk to Frost Fork took less than 20 minutes. But every step felt like a hearing before judgment. Clara walked beside her father. Lucian followed behind with his riders. Ronan led his horse and mule at the rear. Unhurried. Silent. As though the whole cold road had agreed to wait for him. By the time they reached Abel's trading room, word had already run ahead. A blacksmith stood near the stove. Two freight men stopped over their coffee. Mrs. Cale from the dry goods counter pretended to fold cloth while watching everything. Mr. Abel looked up from his ledger. What's this? A debt. Ronan said. And a scale. Lucian stepped forward. This is unnecessary theater. No. Clara said, surprising herself. The receipt in my hand was theater. This is record. A few faces turned toward her. Lucian's expression cooled. Ronan placed a leather pouch on the counter. Not thrown. Not dropped at anyone's feet. Set down with care. Like something meant to be counted. Not flaunted. Amount. Abel asked. $460. Elias said quietly. Ronan opened the pouch. Gold dust and small nuggets slid into Abel's weighing pan. The room went silent except for the soft scrape of metal and the tick of the scale arm settling into balance. Abel adjusted the weights twice. Then he looked up. Enough. He said. More than enough. By my count. Lucian held out his hand. Ronan closed the pouch before Lucian could touch it. Paid receipt first. Lucian's eyes narrowed. You do not give orders here. No? But I hold the gold. The blacksmith gave the smallest cough into his fist. Mr. Abel opened a fresh receipt book. Ronan watched him write every word. Debt paid in full. Interest included. Witnessed by Abel Trading Room. Date. Amount. Names. When the clerk pushed the paper forward, Ronan did not take it. He slid it to Clara. Read it. She did. Every line. Then she looked at Lucian. Sign it. For a moment. She thought he might refuse. But there were too many eyes in the room now. Too many people who had seen the scales settle. Too many witnesses for him to reshape the story later. Lucian signed. Ronan gave him the gold. Only then did Clara understand the difference between being rescued and being protected. Rescue could happen in secret. Protection needed witnesses. Outside the trading room. The wind had sharpened. Lucian mounted his horse and looked down at Clara. Gold pays paper, he said. It does not erase intent. No, Clara answered, holding both receipts now. But it records yours. His face went still. Then he rode away. Ronan watched until the three riders disappeared past the freight shed. Then he turned to Elias and Clara. He'll try another road. Elias looked older than he had that morning. What road? The one where he says she ran. Or I took her. Or your farm is abandoned once winter locks the valley. Ronan's eyes moved to the mountains. The pass closes soon. Clara felt the cold deepen around her. You knew he would do this. I knew men like him don't lose clean. And what do you suggest? Ronan pulled a folded paper from his coat. Not a demand. Terms. Civil marriage. He said. Separate winter quarters. Witness standing. Station ledger. Kept by your hand. If you choose to come up Pineglass Pass with me. He cannot call you stolen property. Runaway collateral. Or a missing daughter used to seize land. Clara stared at him. You want to marry me to stop him from claiming me. I want the law to have fewer lies available. That is not the same as choice. No. Ronan said. It is the shape of the trap. I am showing it to you before asking where you want to step. Clara looked at her father. Then at the false receipt in one hand and the paid receipt in the other. For the first time all day. She understood the fight had not ended. It had only learned to write neater. She lifted her chin. I have terms of my own. They signed the terms before sunset. Not because Clara trusted Ronan Pike. Because she understood Lucian Vale. The civil clerk in Frost Fork kept glancing between them as he filled the marriage record. His pen scratching too loudly in the little office. Elias stood as witness. One hand braced on the back of a chair. Mr. Abel signed beneath him. Clara made the clerk copy the winter terms twice. Separate quarters. No claim on the Voss farm. Station ledger under Clara's keeping. Marriage to be reviewed after spring thaw by Clara's own choice. Ronan read every line without complaint. When the clerk asked if he objected to so many conditions, Ronan only said, a clear paper saves trouble. Clara looked at him then. Not with gratitude. With attention. They left Frost Fork before dawn 2 mornings later. While the town still slept under blue smoke and hard frost. Elias stood at the gate, wrapped in an old quilt. Too proud to stay inside. Too weak to walk with them to the road. You write when you can. He told Clara. If the pass lets anything through. You come back if you need to. Clara wanted to say she would. But the lie would sit between them like another debt. Instead, she touched his hand. I will not let him take the farm by pretending I vanished. Elias closed his eyes. That promise was harder than comfort. The climb to Pineglass Pass took 4 days. The valley road gave way to frozen ruts. Then Pine Trail. Then narrow shelves of stone, where snow lay in blue shadows. Ronan rode ahead on his dun horse and led the pack mule. Never moving faster than Clara's mount could handle. He spoke little. But he watched the weather like it had a face. When she slipped crossing a drift. He did not grab her unless she reached first. When they camped. He put his bedroll on the far side of the fire. When food was ready. He placed her portion near her hand and did not stare to see if she ate. Small things. But small things were where ownership usually showed itself. A man who meant to control you did not begin with chains. He began by deciding when you were cold. When you were hungry. When you had spoken enough. Ronan decided very little for her. That made him harder to hate. Pineglass Pass line station appeared on the fourth afternoon. Half buried in snow and braced against the mountain, like an old shoulder against wind. It was larger than Clara expected. Not a cabin. A station. There was a main room with a stove and 2 desks. A storage room with flour sacks. Salt pork. Lantern oil. Spare boots. Rope. Nails. And dried beans stacked in careful order. A loft with a narrow sleeping space. A back room with a second cot. A wash basin. And a door that latched from the inside. Ronan set her trunk there without comment. Yours, he said. Clara tested the latch. It held. Outside the front door hung a bronze bell. Green with age. A rope ran from it down the porch post. Then toward the trail. What is that for? She asked. Lost travelers. Packers. Anyone caught in weather who can still reach the rope. You hear it from inside. Ronan nodded. Most nights. Most. In high wind. You feel it through the floor. That night. After the animals were settled and the stove had warmed the room. Ronan showed her the station ledger. The book was thick. Bound in cracked brown leather. Its pages filled with names. Dates. Weather notes. Supply debts. Trail conditions. And marks left by people who had passed through years before. Everything gets written. He said. Who comes? Who leaves? What they owe. What they're owed. Who witnessed it. Clara placed her palm on the cover. A strange steadiness moved through her. Paper had nearly stolen her name. Now, paper might help her keep it. On the third shelf above the ledger lay a row of old tally tokens. Bone. Wood. Tin. Each marked with notches. Clara picked up a pale bone piece shaped roughly like a bird. A lark. Maybe. Her fingers went cold. The notches along its wing matched something she had carried since childhood. A small bone token given to her at Platte Bend after she fell through milk-thin ice near the ferry crossing. A boy had pulled her out. A quiet boy with gray eyes and bleeding knuckles who stayed until she stopped shaking. Clara turned slowly. Ronan stood by the stove, watching the token in her hand. Her voice came out low. You were at Platte Bend. He did not deny it. The wind pressed snow against the window. Clara closed her fingers around the bone lark. You knew me before Frost Fork. Ronan looked at the ledger before he looked at her. Yes, he said. And suddenly the pass felt smaller than the truth between them. Clara did not ask Ronan why he had kept the truth from her that night. She wanted to. The question sat on her tongue while the stove cracked and the snow scratched against the station windows. But Ronan had gone quiet in that way of his. Not hiding exactly. Not offering either. Like a man standing at the edge of a frozen creek. Waiting to see if the ice would hold. So Clara opened the ledger instead. You said everything gets written. She said. Ronan looked up. Yes. Then write it. His eyes moved to the bone lark in her hand. Clara set it on the table between them. Write that you knew me before Frost Fork. Write that you recognized me. Write that you paid the debt because of that. Not because you had bought yourself a wife. The words landed hard. Ronan lowered his gaze. Then he took the pen. His handwriting was slow. Cramped. Careful. Clara Voss, known to Ronan Pike from Platte Bend ferry incident. Winter of 1868. Debt payment made to prevent unlawful collateral transfer by Lucian Vale. No claim of ownership made or intended. He turned the ledger toward her. Clara, read every word. Then she dipped the pen and added beneath it. Rescue is not consent. Protection must be recorded. Or it becomes another story told by men. Ronan looked at the line for a long time. That is fair, he said. It is true. Yes. After that, the station changed. Not because trust came all at once. It did not. Trust in Pineglass Pass arrived like spring wood. Slowly and against weather. But the ledger became a third presence in the room. If Ronan brought in supplies, Clara recorded them. If a trapper owed flour, she wrote it. If Ronan changed a trail marker, she marked the date and reason. No spoken agreement was allowed to float loose in the air where someone like Lucian Vale could later twist it. 3 weeks into winter, the first real storm came down from the north. It began with a silence too clean to be peaceful. By afternoon, the sky had closed. By dusk, snow hammered the station walls, so hard, the lantern above the ledger swung on its hook. Ronan stood at the door, one hand on the frame, listening. Clara looked up from the supply count. What is it? He did not answer at first. Then the floor shivered. Once. Faint. The bell. Clara stood. Ronan had already reached for his coat. No, she said. He stopped. You are not going out alone. I know the rope line. And I know how to hold a lantern. The wind will take it. Then we use two. He looked at her. The old Ronan might have refused by silence. This Ronan only nodded once. They tied a rope from the porch post to Ronan's belt, and another from Clara's waist to the station rail. She wrapped the lantern in oiled cloth, leaving just enough light to mark the doorway. Ronan moved into the white dark toward the bell line. The storm swallowed him in 6 steps. Clara held the rope with both hands. The bell shivered again. Then again. Somewhere beyond the porch. A voice called once and vanished under the wind. Clara planted her boots against the boards. Ronan. Hold steady. He called back. She did. The rope went taut. Snow struck her face like thrown sand. Her fingers burned inside her gloves. For one wild second, she thought of Frost Fork. Of Lucian's receipt. Of her name frozen under ice. Then the rope pulled twice. The signal. Clara braced and drew it in. Ronan emerged first. Bent against the storm. One arm around a young packer whose face was gray with cold and fear. The boy stumbled over the threshold and fell hard onto the floor. Clara shut the door behind them with her shoulder. For a moment, there was only breathing. Then the boy whispered. Vale riders below the south cut. Ronan went still. Clara knelt beside the boy. What did you say? He swallowed. Lucian Vale. Men in Frost Fork say he's filing on Voss land come thaw. Says Elias Voss abandoned the farm. Says his daughter left, and the place won't hold through winter. The station seemed to shrink around Clara. Ronan's face darkened. Clara stood slowly and crossed to the ledger. Her hand did not shake when she opened it. We need a packet, she said. Ronan looked at her. For when the pass opens. No, Clara said. For before he writes the next lie alone. She pulled a blue flour sack from the supply shelf and laid it flat on the table. Into it went the false collateral receipt. The paid assay record. The winter terms. The station ledger copies. And the bone lark. Ronan watched her tie the sack closed. You do not have to face him, he said. Clara looked at the storm-dark window. Yes, she said. I do. This time. Ronan did not argue. Spring did not open Pineglass Pass gently. It cracked it. Snow sagged from the south slopes first. Then broke loose in sheets that thundered down gullies and left wet black rock showing underneath. The creek began speaking beneath its ice. The trail markers Ronan had set in winter leaned out of the snow like tired witnesses. On the third morning of thaw, Clara tied the blue flour sack packet beneath her coat. Ronan saddled the dun horse without asking whether she was certain. That was one of the ways she knew he finally understood her. They reached Frost Fork near noon. Mud to the horses' knees. Their coats damp from melting branches. The town looked smaller than Clara remembered. Or maybe she had grown somewhere the town could not measure. Outside the land office, a small crowd had gathered. Her father stood near the steps, wrapped in his old brown coat, one hand on a cane. He looked thinner, older, but he was standing. Lucian Vale stood beside the office door with a clerk at his shoulder and a folded petition in his gloved hand. When he saw Clara, his face did not change. Only his eyes did. "Mrs. Pike," he said. "How fortunate. We were just discussing whether the Voss property had been abandoned." Clara stepped onto the porch. "My father is standing 6 feet from you." Lucian smiled faintly. A sick man standing beside a road does not prove a working homestead. Elias gripped his cane. "That land is mine." "Was." Lucian said softly. "If the land office agrees your household support departed. Your winter improvements failed. And the farm cannot be maintained. The claim may be reviewed." Clara looked past him to the clerk. The clerk would not meet her eyes. Ronan stayed 1 step behind her. Close enough for people to see he stood with her. Far enough that no one could pretend he spoke for her. The land officer, Mr. Harrow, opened the door. Inside, the room smelled of ink, damp wool, and stove smoke. Lucian placed his petition on the desk first. Smooth and confident, Clara placed the blue flour sack packet beside it. The faded cloth looked poor next to Lucian's clean paper. Good, she thought. Let them see what kind of things survived winter. Mr. Harrow looked at her. "What is this?" Proof that Mr. Vale's petition rests on a lie. Lucian sighed. "This girl has been under mountain influence for months. I would advise caution." Clara untied the packet. First, she laid down the false collateral receipt. "My name was written as debt security before the debt came due." A murmur moved through the room. Then, she laid down the assay receipt. The debt was paid in full on a public scale. Witnessed by Mr. Abel, the blacksmith, 2 freight men, and half this town. Mr. Harrow picked up the receipt and read it. Lucian's jaw tightened. Clara laid down the winter terms. "I left Frost Fork as a legal wife under written terms. With no transfer of my father's land. No debt claim. And no surrender of my own consent." She paused. Then she opened the copied station ledger. "Every day I was gone is recorded. Weather. Supply. Witness. Traveler. Work done. My absence was not abandonment. It was protection from a man who had already written me into a paper I never signed." The clerk shifted. Ronan's eyes moved to him. Clara saw it. "So did Mr. Harrow. Is there something you need to say?" The land officer asked the clerk. The young man went pale. Mr. Vale paid filing fees in advance. For the petition. And for transfer review. "When?" Clara asked. The clerk swallowed. "Before winter." The room went silent. Lucian said, "Administrative preparation is not wrongdoing." "No." Clara said. "But pattern is." She placed the notched bone lark on the desk. Lucian stared at it before he could stop himself. Clara saw recognition flicker. "This tally came from Platte Bend Ferry," she said. "The same marking appears in an old ferry ledger. Vale Freight overcharged stranded families there and marked people as owing labor against tolls they had already paid." Mr. Harrow leaned forward. You have that ledger? Ronan finally spoke. A copy. Witnessed at Pineglass Station. Clara turned slightly. Just enough to make it clear he had not taken the moment from her. Then she faced the room again. If your name had been written as a debt before you were even asked, she said. Voice steady. Would you burn the paper to feel free? Or keep it long enough to make every man here read what was done? No one answered. They did not need to. Mr. Harrow took the false receipt, dipped his stamp, and pressed it hard across the page. Void? Then he turned to Lucian Vale. This abandonment petition is denied. All collateral receipts issued through Vale Freight and Loan will be reviewed before any further claim is accepted. Lucian's face went cold. Clara picked up the bone lark and slipped it back into her palm. For the first time since the well bucket, her name belonged to her again. Lucian Vale left the land office without raising his voice. That was how men like him retreated. Not with shouting. Not with apologies. Only with a colder silence. A tighter glove. And a promise folded behind the eyes. But this time, Frostfork had seen the paper. That mattered. By evening, Mr. Harrow posted a notice on the land office door. No debt transfer. Labor receipt. Or collateral paper from Vale Freight and Loan would be accepted without direct witness signatures and voluntary consent from the named person. The words were plain. The effect was not. 2 families came before sunset carrying old receipts. A widow from Miller's Cut brought a folded paper she had kept in a flour tin for 3 years. A freighter with a bad knee brought a toll ledger marked against his oldest boy. They stood in line outside the office. Quiet and stiff. Each holding a small piece of the machine that had been grinding them down. Then Mr. Harrow added a second notice beneath the first. All prior Vale Freight collateral claims subject to review. Clara read that line twice. It did not fix every wrong. But it opened the door that Lucian had spent years keeping locked. Her father sat on the bench outside Abel's trading room. Wrapped in a blanket. His cane across his knees. He looked tired enough to break. But when Clara walked to him, he reached for her hand. I should have protected you better, Elias said. Clara sat beside him. You were trying to keep us alive. That is not the same thing. No, she said. It isn't. He looked toward the road beyond town. Toward the farm. I won't make you the wall holding that house up anymore. The words hurt because they healed something. Clara held his hand tighter. They signed new papers the next morning. Not debt papers. Not transfer papers. Working papers. Elias would keep the Voss farm. A neighbor's son would help with spring planting for wages. Clara had written clearly into the agreement. Clara would have the right to come and go. To write. To return. And to refuse any arrangement made in her name without her hand beneath it. Mr. Harrow read the line twice. Then he nodded and stamped it. Elias took the pen after him. Slow and careful. And added one sentence beneath the agreement. My daughter is not responsible for saving me from every winter. His hand shook when he finished. Clara did not cry. But she kept that paper folded close to her heart the whole ride back. When Clara and Ronan rode toward Pineglass Pass, she did not feel as if she were being carried away. She felt as if she were choosing a road. By the first hard cold of the next winter, Pineglass Pass line station had changed. The bell rope was repaired. The supply shelves were marked. The station ledger sat open on the front desk instead of locked in Ronan's chest. A board beside the door listed flour, beans, coffee, rope, lamp oil, and winter shelter rates in Clara's hand. At the bottom, she had written, no person may be held against a debt. Ronan read it the first time and said nothing. Then he nailed the board higher so snow would not cover it. On the shelf above the ledger sat two notched bone larks. Side by side. One worn smooth from Clara's pocket. One darker from years in Ronan's keeping. One evening, while the stove burned low and snow began tapping against the shutters, Ronan placed his half beside hers and looked at the two small birds. "I kept mine because I did not know where else to put the memory," he said. Clara stood beside him. "Now it has a place." He looked at her then. "And you?" She touched the open ledger. Then the shelf where the two bone larks rested. "I am not here because you paid gold," she said. "I am not here because the pass closed. I am here because this station keeps names from being twisted." A pause. Then she took his hand. "And because you learned to let me write my own." Ronan's fingers closed around hers. Careful, and warm. Outside. The bell rang. Not hard. Not frantic. Just enough. Clara opened the ledger. Ronan lifted the lantern. Together, they opened the station door to a family standing in the snow with tired horses and fear written plainly across their faces. Clara stepped back to let them in. The mother gave her name first. Clara wrote it carefully. Then the father's. Then the children's. No one was reduced to debt. Labor. Or burden. Not in her book. Behind her. On the wall near the old false receipt. Mr. Harrow's stamp showed in dark ink. Void. A person cannot secure a debt. The paper had not vanished. It had become a warning. Clara dipped the pen one final time and wrote at the bottom of the station page. Entered by Clara Voss Pike. Co-keeper. By choice. Then she closed the ledger gently. And Clara Voss Pike. Once written as collateral in another man's hand. Now wrote the names of the living into safety with her own. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.